My brothers and sisters, for too long, the world assumed Burkina Faso had no place at the table. That day, I pulled the table closer and took my seat. Across from me sat Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The room was tense, diplomats shifting, cameras flashing, but all I felt was the weight of my ancestors. For centuries, Africa's voice was ignored while others feasted on our wealth. That silence ended that day. They told me to wait. They told me to accept scraps, but I did not come to beg. I came to negotiate, to trade our gold as sovereigns, not servants. Though 18 billion, not aid, not loans, not chains. A pact written in gold, built on respect. For the first time in generations, Africa's wealth was returning as power. The West trembled, not because of the deal itself, but because it confirmed a truth they fear: most Africa is no longer for sale. For centuries, our gold left our soil silently. Ships carried it across oceans, European banks grew fat, and our villages stayed poor. They called it trade, but it was theft wrapped in contracts. When I rose to power, I swore an oath: Burkina Faso's gold would never leave without value coming back. Every ounce, every coin. Gold is more than metal. It is blood, it is memory, it is dignity. With it, the West built cathedrals, cities, empires. With it, we were left with empty hands. That day in New Delhi, I placed our gold not as tribute, but as leverage, a foundation of equal power. India understood. They did not bring IMF chains or World Bank traps. They came with open books, with respect, with the understanding that this time, Africa set the price. The West laughed once. They are not laughing anymore. When the ink dried on our agreement, the tremor was felt before anyone spoke. By nightfall, Washington was monitoring satellites. Paris held emergency meetings. London whispered into microphones they thought no one could hear. The 18 billion, a number that cut through centuries of expectation. This was not just trade. It was a betrayal of their old script. They expected Africa to stay silent, to keep trading raw blood for scraps. Instead, we flipped the script. The West called it reckless. They called me dangerous. But beneath their anger was fear. Fear that one deal could become 10. One nation could inspire a continent. Their monopoly on Africa's resources was cracking. I knew their next moves before they acted: sanctions, pressure, whispers of destabilization. They always reach for the same weapons when control slips. But this time they are facing a generation that does not kneel. Burkina Faso did not just sign a contract. We sent a message: Africa's gold will no longer fund foreign palaces. It will build African futures. And that message, my friends, is shaking empires tonight. The day the deal was signed, the world's balance quivered, not in Brussels, not in Washington, but in Ouagadougou, where a young African soldier turned president had the courage to declare, "We decide our future." 18 billion worth of Burkina Faso's gold was no longer bound for Paris or quietly shipped to Swiss vaults. It was flowing to India, an old partner rising with the same ambition Africa had always carried. For the West, this was not mere commerce. It was rebellion. Headlines screamed across Europe: Traoré hands gold to India. Burkina Faso risks isolation. China's shadow behind the deal. But beyond the panic, the truth was clear. Africa had broken a century-old chain. Ambassadors flooded Ouagadougou. Sanctions were hinted at. Threats disguised as concerns poured in. They feared not just the deal, but the precedent. If Burkina Faso could trade directly with India, why couldn't Mali, Niger, or Ghana? If one nation could escape the grip of the West, why not all? For too long, Africa's silence had fed Western coffers. That silence had been shattered, and its echo was louder than any cannon. Traoré was not merely selling gold. He was selling freedom. When the ink dried on Burkina Faso's 18 billion gold deal with India, the tremor spread far beyond its borders. It rolled like thunder across the Sahel, reaching villages and capitals alike. Mali's leaders called it a new dawn. Niamey's streets buzzed with talk of gold for freedom. Even Ghana and Senegal, long tied to Western banking systems, began questioning their old loyalties. For decades, Africa's riches had been siphoned through foreign ports, leaving its people with crumbs. But Traoré's move was different. It showed the world that a small, landlocked nation could turn its resources into power, not debt. Farmers, soldiers, and market women in Ouagadougou whispered the same word, dignity. Regional leaders began to meet, not in Paris or Washington, but in Bamako and Niamey. There was talk of forming a united Sahel economic bloc with gold, uranium, and grain as bargaining chips. India, China, and even the Gulf states lined up, eager to forge ties without the old colonial leash. The West mocked it as naive. But on the streets of Africa, people felt something else: momentum. For the first time in living memory, the continent was not begging. It was choosing. Burkina Faso's goal was no longer just a mineral. It had become a torch passed hand to hand, nation to nation, igniting the vision of an Africa that spoke with one voice. And the West could hear it rising. The announcement of Burkina Faso's 18 billion gold deal with India struck like lightning in Western capitals. In Washington, officials whispered of sanctions. In Paris, think tanks warned of dangerous precedent. European banks quietly froze channels, hoping to strangle Burkina Faso's trade. They wanted the young soldier president to kneel. But in New Delhi, the mood was entirely different. India hailed the agreement as a triumph of South-South cooperation. Cargo planes were readied, engineers deployed, and contracts for railways and refining plants were drawn up. Prime ministerial aides praised Traore as the man who proved Africa could be a partner, not a pawn. For India, the deal was not just about gold. It was about reshaping global alliances. Traore watched both storms unfold. On one side, the cold hand of the West, tightening its grip through IMF offers disguised as relief loans. On the other, the open arms of India, betting on Africa's rise as inevitable. But he knew neither side came without cost. Gold was power, yes, but also temptation. Would India remain a true partner, or would it too become a master in disguise? For now, Burkina Faso stood firm. The people cheered as trains of Indian engineers arrived, even as whispers of Western agents plotting sabotage rippled through the markets. Two worlds had collided over Burkina Faso's soil, one desperate to hold control, the other eager to share it. Traore walked the knife's edge between them. The guards in Ouagadougou grew heavier after the deal. Traore moved through the palace corridors with a soldier's calm, but inside, storms clashed. He had given his people a vision, gold no longer smuggled by foreign companies, but traded as a sovereign weapon. Yet he knew the empire he had defied would not retreat quietly. The signs appeared quickly. Western banks delayed every transfer. Cargo routes once open to Burkina Faso suddenly required inspections. Intelligence reached him of meetings in Paris and Brussels, of plans to fund rival factions, whispers of destabilization. The message was clear: if Traore could not be controlled, he would be removed. But as the pressure mounted, so did the resolve of his people. In the markets, traders lifted their heads higher, speaking of gold as their shield. Students painted murals of African hands exchanging bullion with Indian hands, breaking the old colonial chain. The nation had become a battlefield of spirit long before any shots were fired. One evening, Traore paused at his desk, staring at a single gold bar placed before him. To the West, it was a commodity. To him, it was survival. He whispered under his breath, "They cannot take what belongs to the people." The silent war had begun, not with armies, but with sabotage, propaganda, and financial strangulation. In that quiet tension, Traore prepared his next move. The ink on the 18 billion gold pact with India was barely dry. When the first shockwaves hit, Washington sent envoys whispering about stability. Paris called emergency meetings. Brussels issued warnings disguised as concern. But what they feared wasn't just the gold. It was the precedent. For the first time in modern history, a young African nation was setting the terms. I was not begging. I was not bowing. I was trading gold for technology, gold for sovereignty, gold for Africa's tomorrow. They wanted chaos. What they got was order. They wanted weakness. What they saw was strength. As Western newspapers screamed about geopolitical instability, our miners worked with renewed pride, our engineers drew up blueprints for factories, and our people began dreaming with their eyes wide open. The West had long assumed Africa could be bullied into silence. Now, they saw something they could not control: partnership without permission, progress without plunder, dignity without debt. The panic in their capitals was proof that Africa Rising was not fantasy. It was happening. And it had begun with gold, with courage, and with a deal they could never undo. The West reacted quickly, like a wounded beast. Sanctions were whispered. Banks began reviewing transactions. Foreign media painted me as reckless, dangerous, unfit. They wanted the world to see a villain, not a leader. But let me be clear, when you own your gold, when you command your resources, you cannot be broken by headlines. Every attempt to isolate us only proved their fear. Every sanction became a badge of honor. India stood firm. The deal remained untouched. And as the news spread, other nations began asking the same question. If Burkina Faso could reclaim its power, why not us? If Burkina Faso can stand tall, why not us? South Africa whispered of coal. Nigeria spoke of oil. Mali and Niger, my brothers in struggle, nodded with pride. A chain reaction had begun, and no empire could stop it. The West tried their usual tactics: divide, threaten, destabilize. But this time, Africa had something new. Unity forged in suffering, ambition fueled by our own wealth, courage led by a generation unwilling to kneel. Their counter moves only revealed the truth. They were not protecting democracy. They were protecting their control. And with every passing day, their grip loosened. I told my people, we will not fear the storm. We are the storm. The 18 billion deal was not just an agreement. It was a declaration. Africa was no longer a pawn. Africa was a player. When the ink dried, I knew it was more than a contract. It was a torch lit in the heart of Africa, carried by hands that refused to bow. For too long, the wealth beneath our feet was stolen, hidden, and sold back to us at a price. Now, we had proven that Africa's riches could serve Africa first. Gold was no longer a chain around our necks. It had become a key in our hands. I walked through the streets of Ouagadougou after the announcement. Mothers held their children tighter. Farmers lifted their heads with pride. Soldiers stood taller. Hope had returned, not as a whisper, but as a roar. India had chosen partnership over plunder, showing the world that fair trade is possible when you have the courage to demand it. But this dawn is not mine alone. It belongs to every African who dared to dream. To the ancestors who resisted, the youth who fight, the nations that rise together. The West will not stop. They will scheme, threaten, try to break us. But this time, Africa is not afraid. This is the beginning of a new era. The era where Africa speaks with its own voice, stands on its own wealth, and walks its own path. And I promise you this, the sun that has risen in Burkina Faso will not set.